This episode is brought to you by my friends at Patreon. If you'd like to join them and get early audios of upcoming episodes, please see the link in the description. This video is intended to be the follow-up to my first video on the development of nuclear physics, which, as you can imagine, is a fairly broad topic. However, as I delved into the books, I was drawn ever more specifically to a single person and a single story, Lise Meitner. I'd be curious to know if you've heard of Lise Meitner. I had, though I had no idea what she'd accomplished. It's not quite right, and never has been, to say that she's been forgotten by history, but she has certainly been the victim of a not quite intentional act of marginalization. Her life and achievements are remarkable, almost romantic. A shy, closed, and deeply self-deprecating woman who would face the horrors of ethnic persecution only to envision the single greatest and darkest power ever granted humanity. And the more I learned of her, the more I saw a kindred spirit speaking to me from the past. When one learns that one is on the autistic spectrum, one begins to notice fellow travelers in history. And Lise Meitner certainly rang bells for me. Lise Meitner was born on the 7th of November, 1878, in Vienna, then the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was, as it had been for centuries, a cultural nexus, with concert halls, writers, and the beginnings of Art Nouveau. Lise was quiet, shy, small, and thin. Throughout her life, she never attained a weight higher than 45 kilograms. Despite the Germanic call of the day for Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, which all women of the time were expected to heed, Lise had little time for suitors. She preferred days in the picturesque beer gardens, listening to performances of Brahms. Her father, Philipp Meitner, was a lawyer, chess master, and freethinker, descendant of a nascent Jewish middle class that had emerged thanks to the liberalizing policies of Joseph II. Lise's mother, Hedwig, was a prodigious musician. Philip determined that all his children, male and female, attain higher education. He was less clear on what they should do afterwards. Lise's passion for science began in early childhood. She was fascinated by the ephemeral, chaotic fractal universes observed in oil slicks and bubble sheets, and kept a scientific journal of observations under her pillow. She idolized Florence Nightingale and Marie Curie, but, wary of poverty, wondered if she could follow in their footsteps. Her first science experiment came when her grandmother warned her not to sew on the Sabbath, or the heavens would fall. She took a needle, gently touched it to the cloth, and, after seeing no effect, drove it in and then continued her work. Her father initially refused her request to gain a professional degree, not because he disapproved of it, but simply because there were no women in the professions, and her chances of making a living as a doctor, lawyer, politician, or even a grade school teacher were essentially nil. Women were not even allowed to attend the state university until 1897. 5 years after Lise completed high school. Eventually, Lise found the precise way to frame her request. "Father, would you let me go to university so I can learn the things Marie Curie knows?" At that, Philip conceded, and later commented that she should have become a lawyer. Thankfully, women were not required to have attended the proper school to enroll at the University of Vienna. All they had to do was pass the entrance exam. To do so, she received private tuition from a professor who crammed 8 years of education into 2 and sneaked them into labs after hours to perform experiments. The exam was held in a boys' school. She and 2 other girls faced a gamut of leering faces as they sat at their desks. They all passed. Lise entered the University of Vienna in 1901. As you can imagine, life as one of the first female students was far from perfect. When you are the only woman in the room, Auditing classes becomes an awkward proposition. Star pupils could join their professors for a beer at the local. Lise was obviously excluded. Her treatment from her lab colleagues often led her to walk the streets of Vienna mumbling, "Not fair." Her first friend at the university was Ludwig Boltzmann, pioneer of thermodynamics, on whom she had developed something of an intellectual crush. After each lecture, it seemed to us as if we had been introduced to a new and wonderful world. Such was the enthusiasm that he put into what he taught, Lise wrote later. His wife had been an aspiring physics teacher who had been forbidden to audit classes, so he sympathized with Lise's situation. Other people noted his mood swings, his withering attitude toward those he disliked, and his cluelessness about anything that wasn't physics. Her second ally was Franz Exner, who supervised her PhD. When it came time for her to take her final exam, Lise fell prey to that lack of self-confidence that would plague her for the rest of her life and eventually endanger it. No woman had ever been granted a physics degree by the University of Vienna. And even if she was, who would take her seriously? Exner eventually resorted to brutal reverse psychology, taunting her for not taking her exam and all the opportunities she had thrown away. It worked. Lise graduated summa cum laude in 1906, the same year Pierre Curie fell under a carriage. After graduating, she attained an unpaid position as Boltzmann's assistant's assistant. Her graduate thesis became her first published paper. Upon the publication of her second, she rushed to tell Boltzmann, only to learn that he had committed suicide. One of the candidates for Boltzmann's position was Max Planck, who by this time had already revolutionized the whole of science by founding quantum theory. While he didn't take up the position, he traveled to the University of Vienna for the interview, and there met Lise Meitner, for whom, upon learning that Boltzmann had never taught her quantum theory, he gave the university's first ever lecture on the topic to her and her alone. Upon returning to her parents, she declared that she wanted to study radiation. Both her parents objected, her father on the grounds that it was too dangerous, her mother on the grounds of Kinder, Küche, Kirche. She consoled them by telling them that she'd be in Berlin for 6 months at the outmost. She stayed for 31 years. When Lise arrived at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, now Humboldt University, she immediately renewed her acquaintance with Max Planck, attending not only all his lectures, but also lunches at his home. Planck had somewhat unreconstructed opinions regarding women in the sciences. When Lise approached him requesting to continue her studies, he cried, "But you're a doctor already! What more do you want?" But he still grasped Lise's talent. Quote, "Amazons are abnormal, even in intellectual fields. But if a woman possesses a special gift in the tasks of theoretical physics, and also the drive to develop her talent, which does not happen often but does on occasion, I consider it unjust from a personal as well as an objective point of view to categorically deny her the means to study as a matter of principle." Planck and his 2 daughters soon became Lise's closest friends. In her diary, she noted his fondness for tag. Lise still needed a collaborator, one with whom, as a beginner, she felt free to ask questions, and was put in touch with Otto Hahn, a chemist looking to partner with a physicist. Lise and Hahn immediately connected, Hahn putting her at ease with his tales of navigating his way around England with faulty English. The two struck up a working friendship, though it required that Lise join the chemistry department, the head of which, Emil Fischer, disallowed women from his labs on the grounds that their long hair got in the way. Eventually he relented, on condition that Lise not enter the chemistry department. Lise and Hahn took up residence in a disused carpentry shop and began their work. To use the toilet, Lise walked to a restaurant down the street. Her position had no pay, and she was dependent on her father for funds. "My father had no objection to me as a woman getting a scientific education," Lise wrote later. "He just never expected me to put it to use." In 1909, Kaiser Wilhelm, concerned that Germanic attitudes may be stifling a generation of Marie Curies, lifted all restrictions on women in science, and Lise was able to join the chemistry department with Hahn. Their job largely consisted of chemically isolating and identifying radioactive elements and their decay products. Over time, they both developed headaches, dizziness, diarrhea, and rashes on their fingertips, which they attributed to overwork and overwashing. In 1910, Lise used a science conference in Salzburg to visit her parents, who were horrified at her sickly appearance. Her mother blamed the water in Berlin. The headaches only stopped after they instituted shielding to prevent cross-contamination. In 1912, the Kaiser established a new chemistry institute, called, naturally enough, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, at Dahlem on the outskirts of Berlin. Lise and Hahn were granted their own lab, called the Lise Meitner Lab, and Hahn was even given a paid position. Planck then leveled the field somewhat by making Lise an assistant professor at the Friedrich Wilhelm Institute, which largely meant she marked his papers. But it was a paycheck, and none too soon, as her father had died 2 years earlier. Planck had wanted to make her a full professor, but Germany wasn't ready for that. In 1913, Friedrich Soddy, the radiochemist who, alongside Hahn's old colleague Ernst Rutherford, first identified elemental transmutation, revolutionized Hahn and Lise's work. He had realized that while the periodic table had only 11 elements between lead and uranium, radioactive elements had shown up to 40 chemically distinct elemental forms. An element is defined by the number of protons in its atomic nucleus. Soddy concluded that there must exist variants of elements which, despite sharing the same number of protons, must possess a different atomic mass. He named these variations isotopes, meaning same place. Then, in 1914, Europe descended into what would become the bloodiest conflict in human history. "Why now?" Lise wrote. "Just when we've hit upon isotopes." Hahn was called up for active duty, but spent much of the war developing chemical weapons for Fritz Haber, the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, an experience he later claimed morally numbed him. Lise received a battle commission as an X-ray technician. Her first sight of war wounded made her faint, much to the chagrin of her superior officer, who had demanded they not send a woman. The troops died at such a rate that the Catholic priest had to deliver last rites to Jews and Protestants. She was shunted around Europe seeking useful position, but was stymied by the sheer stalemate of the war. Lise eventually fell into the rhythm of her job, so much so that when she finally received her discharge papers in 1917, she held them up to the light, like an X-ray. That same year, Hahn and Lise's joint career reached its first peak. For years they had believed that actinium, element 89, discovered in 1902, had to have a parent element, which they eventually identified in the decay series of uranium-238 to 234. They didn't call them uranium-238 and uranium-234, by the way, because they hadn't discovered neutrons yet. But the names they did use, such as radiothorium and actinium X, are so confusing I'm sticking with the modern names. The element, number 91, released an alpha particle, 2 protons, 2 neutrons, to become actinium. Despite having done most of the work to identify this new element, Lise deferred to Hahn's authorship out of loyalty. Stefan Meyer, a friend of Lise's from her days at the University of Vienna, who now ran its Radium Research Institute, suggested the new element be called Lisenium. But Lise, in typical unassuming fashion, named it protoactinium, later shortened to protactinium. Lise, being Lise, forgot to mention her discovery at a party held to celebrate German physics, during which Fritz Haber claimed he would pay the debts Germany had incurred in the Treaty of Versailles by extracting gold from seawater. Fritz Haber's life is a story of such earth-shaking cosmic irony and consequence that Sophocles himself with all the fire of the gods at his command, could not have written it. But unfortunately, much of it is beyond the scope of this video. By 1919, the Weimar Republic was already shaking. Stefan Meyer wrote to Lise that meat and milk are forgotten words, coal is non-existent, and wood is scarce and expensive. Lise wrote that her fear for the health of the Reich was a greater pain than the lack of food and heat. Anti-Semitic attacks were on the rise. It was only by the force of Max Planck's will that Einstein stayed in Germany. In 1920, Niels Bohr, the eminent Danish physicist, came to Berlin for the first time to lecture at the Berlin University Physics Building. Lise felt annoyed that she couldn't understand anything. Professors had monopolized all the questions. She asked Planck, with whom Bohr was staying, to allow Bohr to give a lecture to the non-professors at Dahlem. Haber agreed to hold the party in his villa, but only if Einstein was also invited. In 1921, Manne Siegbahn of Lund University in Sweden invited Lise to give a series of lectures on radioactivity. There she became firm friends with both Niels Bohr and his wife Margareta. While with Siegbahn, she learned about X-ray spectroscopy, which, upon her return to Berlin, she applied to beta radiation, the second type of radiation, along with alpha and gamma, discovered by Ernest Rutherford. She soon identified a phenomenon of the release of electrons of atoms, now called the Auger-Meitner effect. In 1926, Lise was made a full professor, the first woman professor of physics in Germany. As part of that promotion, Lise was required to deliver a public lecture. Called Problems in Cosmic Physics, it was reported by the local press as Problems in Cosmetic Physics. Upon seeing that, Lise exploded first in righteous wrath and then in fits of laughter. Soon, grad students from across the world were arriving at the Institute to perform experiments under her supervision. In 1927, Charles Drummond Ellis and William Alfred Worcester measured the energy of beta decay and found that the beta decay spectrum was off by 0.01 megaelectron volts, something Lise thought impossible. In 1930, Lise received a letter from Wolfgang Pauli, suggesting that the excess energy could be accounted for by the release of a tiny particle with no electric charge, which in 1934 Enrico Fermi called the neutrino. It would be 22 years before that particle was finally detected. Just to confuse things even more, 1932 saw the discovery of the neutron, the electrically neutral particle that, along with the proton, forms the atomic nucleus. Unlike the proton, the neutron could break through the electromagnetic barrier of the nucleus to alter atomic structure. Fermi had noted that water, paraffin, and other hydrogen-rich substances slowed neutrons, allowing them to more easily collide with atoms. By employing a neutron bullet, Fermi found he could shift elements 1 or 2 places up or down the periodic table. Except when, in 1934, he arrived at uranium. Rather than a product 2 spaces down, Fermi's result showed the element rhenium 16 spaces down. Fermi concluded that he could not have made rhenium, and instead that he had discovered a so-called transuranic element, an element beyond uranium with rhenium's chemical properties. As far as the periodic table was understood at the time, eka-rhenium, as it was called, would have been element 93. This was the overwhelming consensus at the time. The only dissenting view was by Ida Nodak, one of Lise's few female friends in physics, who suggested that the neutron had in fact split the uranium atom in 2, and that the element behaved like rhenium because it was rhenium. This idea, however, was not widely considered, even by Lise. But transmutation, Lise and her kin would soon learn, was not solely the ability of atoms. the human soul and the souls of nations could transmute too, given enough force. And, just as when an atom mutates into an unnatural form, when a human soul is turned, the results are insidiously toxic. On the 30th of January 1933, at the behest of those who sought to control him, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within 3 months, Dachau concentration camp opened. A month later, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, the Berufsbeamtengesetz, prohibited Jews from holding civil service, university, and state positions. Lise felt she would be exempt, as she was an Austrian, and thus not subject to German law. That, at least, was what Hahn told her before heading off on a 4-month lecture series at Cornell, to the chagrin of Lise, who believed he had abandoned her. Her Jewish colleagues were all resigning, willingly or not. Their students and colleagues did nothing, in part because, in a time of full employment, they looked to benefit from vacancies. Nobel Prize winner James Frank, one of Lise's closest Jewish friends, resigned in protest, triggering a national scandal. In a wondrous piece of totalitarian doublethink, a Nazi letter simultaneously condemned Frank for his unpatriotic act, whilst also arguing that the expulsion of the Jews from Germany be expedited. "At this rate," she cried to Hahn, "they'll be coming for Fritz Haber." Hahn didn't believe it. Yes, Haber was a Jew, but he was also a war hero who had kept the Germans alive with his artificial fertilizers, and its enemies dead with chemical weapons. Hahn was also convinced the regime would soon fail. That year, Max Planck made the mistake of attempting to reason with Hitler. Interceding on behalf of Haber, he argued that without his inventions, quote, the previous war would have been lost from the beginning, and that, while some Jews were objectionable, many represented the best of German culture. "That is not correct," said Hitler. "A Jew is a Jew. All Jews stick together like burrs. Where there is one Jew, immediately other Jews of all kinds collect." Planck argued that the dismissal of Jewish scientists was, quote, an act of self-mutilation, to which Hitler replied, quote, "If the dismissal of Jewish scientists means the annihilation of contemporary German science, then we shall do without science for a few years." He then began to work himself into such a fury that Planck realized that further discussion was pointless. He also likely realized that his career was now on borrowed time. They didn't come for Fritz Haber. Haber resigned his position, claiming he wanted no special treatment. A year later, he died in exile in Switzerland of a heart attack. Only his colleague at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics, Max von Laue, dared write his obituary, and for that was called a Jew lover, a term he took pride in. Von Laue's refusal to allow Johannes Stark, a Nazi and supporter of so-called Deutsche Physik, a term von Laue found ridiculous, into the Prussian Academy of Sciences, resulted in his dismissal at the end of the year. Legend has it that he left his office carrying packages so he wouldn't have to give the Nazi salute. With her boss gone, Lise had to justify her continued presence at the Institute. Her letter, as was required, was signed Meitner, Dr. Lise, birth country, Austria, birth town, Vienna, Jew. Lise hated the way her hand trembled as she wrote that final word. In 1935, Lise, von Laue, and hundreds of others braved arrest and a cordon of soldiers to attend a memorial service for Fritz Haber, organized by Planck. For anyone else, this would have been suicide, but IG Farben, the chemical company central to German industry, had made billions from Haber's invention, and Karl Bosch, its founder, would be in attendance. Nonetheless, the atmosphere was positively transuranic. The musical interludes seemed to go on forever. In 1936, Max Planck's term as president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society ended and was not renewed. Then, in 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, denying Lise the fig leaf of her Austrian status. She was now a German Jew, subject to German policy. Even aside from that, she faced unfounded rumors and rebellions from Nazi students. Luckily, the new head was Karl Bosch, who very much wanted her to stay. Paul Scherrer, a Swiss physicist, just 2 days after the Anschluss, wrote to Lise imploring her to attend a completely fabricated event in Zurich. Niels Bohr, who was Jewish on his mother's side and had been helping refugee scientists since 1933, offered her a spot at a seminar in Copenhagen, all expenses paid. She turned it down. Her lab was her life, and she couldn't imagine leaving it. In both 1936 and 1937, Planck, Werner Heisenberg, and von Laue nominated Lise for a Nobel Prize, both because she richly deserved it and because the extra attention might serve as cover. On the 7th of April, 1938, Lise's lecturing privileges were revoked. Planck and Hahn both wrote letters of protest, despite Hahn, an instinctive German patriot, having informed the Toronto Star that any perceived persecution of Jews in Germany was really suppression of communism. On the 22nd of April, 1938, Lise wrote in her diary, Bosch related what Horlein, the top Nazi on the board of IG Farben, told him about the conversation with Hahn, and he must find out what the truth is. Promises are of no use. They are not kept. Possibilities are narrowing. Lise was now boxed in, able to perform her research, but unable to communicate with anyone outside her laboratory. Thankfully, most of Lise's family were now in London. Many others, including James Frank and Lise's sister Lola, had already left for the United States. Frank, now at the University of Chicago, offered to sponsor her if she decided to emigrate, but Lise couldn't imagine traveling somewhere as alien to her as the United States. Eventually, she decided that she would flee to Copenhagen. Unfortunately, with the Anschluss, the Danes no longer considered her Austrian passport valid, and the Nazis were in no hurry to grant her a new one. She appealed to Karl Bosch, who wrote a laudatory letter to Wilhelm Frick, the Minister of the Interior, outlining Lise's accomplishments. Weeks passed. Dirk Koster, a friend in the Netherlands who had sheltered many Jewish refugees, offered her sanctuary, as did Scherrer again, but it was no use. Without travel documents, she had no way out. Eventually, Bosch received his reply, quote, It is considered undesirable for renowned Jews, underlined, to travel abroad to act against the interests of Germany. That was it. Lise was trapped. The doors slammed shut. Bosch considered appealing directly to Heinrich Himmler, but was, unsurprisingly, advised against it. Later correspondence suggested that Himmler had taken a personal interest in Lise's case. The guest, quote-unquote, department head, the Nazi Kurt Hess, proclaimed, The Jewess endangers the Institute. Horlein relayed to Hahn that Lise should resign. When Hahn relayed that to her, she yelled at him for betraying her, and then returned to the Institute anyway. Lise did the only thing she could do. She focused on her work. Her life was her lab and her friends, and she refused to leave either. So she experimented long into the evening on the so-called transuranic elements. The first inklings of what would be her great discovery were already before her eyes. Bombardment of uranium with neutrons was producing products with 3 different half-lives. Hahn didn't care until a rival of his noticed that the properties of one of the daughter elements were similar to protactinium. In December 1934, Lise and Hahn were able to show conclusively that the resulting elements from the bombardment of uranium with neutrons were not transuranic. What they were, they had no idea. Given that only small particles, like neutrons and alpha particles, could break through the nucleus's electromagnetic barrier, only small changes to an element, say a few slots on the periodic table, were possible. So, what were these? Even though the results were, by her own admission, very difficult to reconcile with models of the nucleus, Lise concluded that these new atoms had to be electrically excited variations of uranium-239. No one challenged her. Hahn and Lise couldn't see they were one step away from making the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century. The problem, Lise remarked later, was that no one looked at the residue from the experiment. Lise was not a chemist, and so deferred to Hahn in such matters. While Lise was working, a chattering trans-European network of allies and friends began to coalesce on her behalf, all attempting to find her some way out of Germany. On the 27th of June, thanks in large part to pressure from Niels Bohr and Dirk Koster, Lise received an offer from Manne Siegbahn, now at the Nobel Institute of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, for a one-year position in his still unfinished physics department. She accepted. On July 11th, the University of Stockholm granted her provisional admission. She now had somewhere to go, but no way to get there. After 3 weeks of continuous fundraising, Koster and his friends managed to raise enough money to maintain Lise for 1 year. Pushing it farther was dangerous. The more appeals they made, the more attention they drew to her case. Time was running out. Lise transferred her bank account to Stockholm days before the Nazis banned Jews from doing so. And what was arguably the single most vital component of the scheme, a Dutch border guard agreed to ignore Lise's invalid passport. On July 12th, upon her arrival at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Hahn informed Lise that she would be leaving the next day for the Netherlands. She had barely enough time to pack 2 small suitcases. Those, and the clothes on her back, were all she had. Friends managed to scrounge a few marks, and Hahn gave her his mother's diamond ring, both as a last resort for emergencies and, perhaps, a final token of admiration. Kurt Hess, realizing Lise was about to flee, notified the SS, who then, thankfully and presumably unwittingly, notified one of her friends, who delayed notifying them back until she was already gone. Lise was in no shape to run. She was nearly 60 years old, and the years of radiation had not been kind. More significantly, she had no concept of her life outside the small world she had built for herself in Berlin. As Hahn was driving her to the train station, she begged him to turn back. The train was peppered with Nazi and SS uniforms. For 7 hours, she and Koster sat on uncomfortable wooden seats. Upon arrival in the Netherlands, the German border guards glanced down at her and passed her by. It's possible they assumed she was the wife of a professor. With Lise's arrival in Groningen, telegrams began buzzing. "The baby has arrived," said one. "What will be the name of your charming daughter?" asked another. Quantum pioneer Wolfgang Pauli, who had just undergone a travail not dissimilar to Lise's, telegraphed Koster from Switzerland, saying that, quote, "You have made yourself more famous for the abduction of Lise Meitner than for hafnium," that is, the element he discovered. Fame, however, was not something anyone involved in this scheme desired. Soon after her flight, Hahn wrote to her saying, "A certain difficulty could arise insofar as in your case a personal consultation with Heinrich Himmler has been advised. If they were to learn you were no longer in Germany, they might be cross." This could very well rank as the single greatest understatement in history. Hahn had been severely grilled by officials over his role in Lise's escape. That a prominent Jew had fled from under their noses was an embarrassment, to say the least. Lise knew nothing of this. She only knew that she was in a foreign city, exhausted both physically and mentally, penniless, stateless, and homeless. But she was alive. And she was loved. A sizable cohort of concerned friends had placed themselves at great risk to ensure she had arrived where she was. It was thanks to the Costers, Dirk and his wife, that she had a place to stay. She confronted her plight with remarkable stoicism. "My situation is not pleasant," she wrote, "but there was no point in dwelling on it. Things will develop." Things did develop. The Swedish government initially refused her entry without a note from the German government saying that she could return at any time. Presumably after being told this was physically impossible, on the 26th of July they approved her visa without restriction. 2 days later, Lise took a nerve-wracking plane ride to Copenhagen, which required flying over Germany. After hours of wondering if the plane would need an emergency landing, she arrived, and, much to her relief and delight, was greeted by a friendly face. Otto Frisch. Otto Frisch was Lise's sister Gusti's son. While the majority of her siblings had, much like Lise, taken up scientific or medical professions, her older sister Grisella was a doctor, her younger sister Frida was a mathematician, her younger brother Fritz was an engineer, and her youngest brother Walter was an industrial chemist. Her older sister Gusti had taken after their mother and become an accomplished pianist, while her husband Justinian, Jutz Frisch, was a lawyer. Despite his pedigree, Otto had, since his very early days, idolized his Tante Lise and determined to follow her footsteps into atomic physics. At 23, he gained a physics position in Berlin, absolutely not thanks to his aunt, who refused to engage in any form of nepotism. He eventually took up a position at the University of Hamburg, where he was able to accurately measure the magnetic moment of a proton for the first time. When, like the rest of his family, he had to flee, he came to England, where he took up a position at Birkbeck. Copenhagen, of course, also meant Niels Bohr, who, greeting Lise with a twinkle in his eye, asked if she'd like to play a game. Lise groaned that she was too tired for billiards, but Bohr laughed and said it wasn't that kind of game. The billiard balls, he explained, represented the electrons around the nucleus, and how they can jump from one energy level to the next. He had adapted the model to show how a neutron could impact an atom. Bohr had been exploring the model of a nucleus as a liquid drop, as a cohesive mass of particles held together by surface tension. When struck by a neutron or other energized particle, the particle and the atom merged to form a vibrating, thrumming whole that trilled with energy until the reaction ceased. The idea that anything more dramatic could occur had not entered Bohr's, or indeed anyone else's, farthest imaginings. When Lise arrived in Stockholm, her mind buzzed with all the experiments she could be doing. The reality was a crushing disappointment. Siegbahn appeared to have no interest in nuclear physics, and to view his obligation to Lise as simply keeping her alive. Her stipend was barely that granted to a young assistant, and what few rooms in the still unfinished apartment had suitable equipment were dominated by student professors speaking in Swedish, a language Lise barely knew. Lise maintained an unnervingly naive outlook on her position in Germany. She had been dismissed in August. That she understood, but could never grasp why her pension wasn't being paid. In fact, Germans were no longer under any obligation to honor contracts with Jews, a law that many, I am sure, took too heartily. "Here everyone is very friendly," wrote Lise Hahn, "but I am reminded of the old saying, if one must rely on the friendliness of people, one must either be very self-confident or have a great sense of humor. The first I never possessed, and the latter is difficult to call forth in my current situation." Her clothes finally arrived mid-October, subject to a massive levy. At that point, they were all she had. Equipment was not forthcoming. Her pension, she now knew, was lost. and her only contacts in Germany were Hahn and his new partner, Fritz Strassmann. She was even denied her own set of keys. Bohr advised me to be patient. What else could he do? Lise wrote. I can do nothing else but live my life as it actually is. The 7th of November 1938 marked Lise's 60th birthday. As was typical of her, she pleaded with Hahn not to make a fuss. But Otto Frisch, ever loyal, gathered friends old and new for afternoon tea anyway. 2 days later, Kristallnacht began. The Germans did not call it Kristallnacht. It would earn that name from its victims. It was a series of spontaneous riots and unrests, triggered by the attempted assassination in Paris of a German diplomat by a young Jewish man, angry that his parents had been exiled from Germany. Although it gained its fame and name for the broken glass left by looters and vandals of Jewish shops, that was just the start. Synagogues were set alight, and firemen were told to let them burn. Jewish cemeteries were defiled. The result? 20,000 Jews were arrested and placed in concentration camps like Dachau, while the already impoverished Jews were fined 1 billion marks for the damages. Otto Hahn barely noticed Kristallnacht, having spent what he called a lovely evening with Lise's remaining family, her sisters Gusti and Giselda, and their husbands, Jutz and Karl. When he heard that Jutz had been arrested, he took the night train back to Berlin. And when he heard that he was in Dachau, he urged Lise not to panic, as many had returned from there. Lise desperately attempted to get him released. One always thinks life in this world cannot get much harder, she wrote to von Laue. But one is mistaken. On the 10th of November, the last night of Kristallnacht, Lise, Bohr, and Hahn came together in Copenhagen. She and Hahn never spoke of their discussions, even in their letters, but it was clear that both she and Bohr were unhappy with Hahn's claim that the strange products of uranium bombardment were merely excited variations of radium. Despite her exile, her opinion was law among the team in Berlin, and when she demanded that Hahn scrutinize his results one more time, he did. During Christmas 1938, Lise and Otto Frisch were on holiday in a deserted seaside resort near Göteborg, visiting friends of Niels Bohr, when Lise received a letter from Hahn. It was an unusual letter in that it focused entirely on a single uranium bombardment experiment, one whose results were staggering enough to require Lise's guidance. 19th of December, 1938. Monday Eve in the lab. Dear Lise, it is now just 11 p.m. At 11:45, Strassmann is coming back so that I can eventually go home. Actually, there is something about the radium isotopes that is so remarkable that for now, we are telling only you. The half-lives of these 3 isotopes have been determined quite exactly, that they can be separated from all elements except barium. All reactions are consistent with radium. Only one is not. Unless there are very unusual coincidences, the fractionation doesn't work. We are coming steadily closer to the frightful conclusion. Our radium isotopes do not act like radium, but like barium. All other transuranes are out of the question. We know for ourselves that uranium can't actually burst apart into barium. Now we want to test whether the actinium isotopes derived from the radium behave not like actinium, but lanthanum. Lise knew the result was not an error. Hahn was too good a chemist for that. On December 28th, Hahn indulged in a fantasy that uranium could break into barium or lanthanum, and one of the elements 43 to 46. In his report announcing the result, Hahn wrote, "We cannot yet bring ourselves to take this step, which contradicts all previous experiences in nuclear physics. There could still be perhaps a series of unusual coincidences that have given us deceptive results. Lise's reaction to Hahn's letter has become legendary. I'll let Otto Frisch tell it in his own words. We walked up and down in the snow, I on skis and she on foot. She said and proved that she could get along just as fast that way, and gradually the idea took shape that this was no chipping or cracking of the nucleus, but rather a process to be explained by Bohr's idea that the nucleus was like a liquid drop. Such a drop might elongate and divide itself. We know that there were strong forces that could resist such a process, just as the surface tension of an ordinary liquid drop resists its division into two smaller ones. But nuclei differed from ordinary drops in one important way. They were electrically charged, and this was known to diminish the effect of the surface tension. At this point, we both sat down on a tree trunk and started to calculate on the scraps of paper. The charge of a uranium nucleus, we found, was indeed large enough to destroy the effect of surface tension almost completely. In her mind, Lise saw the liquid drop of an atom buckle as the neutron hit it, become wasp-wasted, and split. There was no one around for miles, but Lise felt she heard a distant bang. Uranium was element 92. Barium was element 56. 92 minus 56 was 36. Krypton, a gas. He would not have tested for it. Frisch continues. So the uranium nucleus might indeed be a very wobbly, unstable drop, ready to divide itself for the slightest provocation, such as the impact of a neutron. But there was another problem. When the two drops separated, they would be driven apart by their mutual electric repulsion and would require a very large energy, about 200 mega-electron volts in all. Where could that energy come from? Then it hit her. E equals mc squared. Remembering a formula for converting mass into energy, she did the calculations. She stared at her nephew. He continues. The two nuclei formed by the division of a uranium nucleus would be lighter than the original uranium nucleus by about 1/5 the mass of a proton. And 1/5 the proton mass was just equivalent to 200 mega-electron volts. So here was the source of the energy. It all fit. This was a staggering revelation, one not even Lise had entertained before. For years, the nuclear physics community had been searching for transuranic elements with the chemical properties of lighter elements. Lise had shown what in retrospect seems blindingly obvious. They didn't just have the properties of those lighter elements. They were those lighter elements. Frisch immediately showed Lise's calculations to Niels Bohr, who slapped his forehead. "Oh, what idiots we have been," he cried. "Oh, this is just wonderful. This is how it must be." Bohr was sworn to secrecy until the results were published, but forgot to inform a certain Leon Rosenfeld, who blabbed it all over America. It was the eve of World War, yet science was still being conducted freely in the spirit of unhindered inquiry. The image of the bifurcating water drop so resembled that of a dividing cell that Frisch contacted William A. Arnold, a biologist acquaintance, and asked him what the technical term for cell division was. "Binary fission," Arnold said. On the 11th of February 1939, Frisch and Meitner's joint paper appeared in Nature, titled Disintegration of Uranium by Neutrons, a New Type of Nuclear Reaction. In the body, Frisch suggested that the new reaction be named fission. Lise received a grant to study her discovery from the University of Stockholm, most of which was spent on phone bills between herself and Hahn. Soon Hahn developed a means to identify noble gases by their radioactive decay products, and thus caught the elusive krypton. Fission was confirmed. Lise's moment of scientific reverie would set off a cascade of events that would lead to a new era for humanity. The time between her dream amid the snows of Kungälv and the obliteration of an entire city in a single detonation was 79 months. Lise wanted no part of that, but regardless, she had a role to play. And I will be discussing that role in the concluding episode